Imagine this. It's 1943, the heart of World War II, and Rome has just fallen under Nazi occupation. The streets are crawling with Gestapo agents, SS soldiers patrol every corner, and anyone caught helping Allied prisoners or Jews faces immediate execution. The Vatican, that tiny neutral enclave in the center of the Eternal City, is surrounded by one of the most brutal regimes in human history. Now picture a single Irish priest standing at the edge of St. Peter's Square, staring across an invisible line painted on the cobblestones. That line is the border between the Vatican and Nazi-occupied Rome. On one side, sanctuary. On the other, death. And this priest, this unassuming man in a black cassock, is about to cross that line every single night to orchestrate the most audacious rescue operation the Nazis never saw coming. His name was Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, but the Gestapo would come to know him by another name, the Pimpernel of the Vatican. And the story you're about to hear is not just true, it's the reason Hollywood made a movie about it. But what they didn't show you in that film is how terrifyingly close he came to being caught, tortured, and executed dozens of times. Before we dive into the cat-and-mouse game that would consume the next 2 years, you need to understand what Rome looked like in the autumn of 1943. Just months earlier, the Allies had invaded Sicily, Mussolini had been overthrown, and for a brief moment it seemed like Italy might switch sides and join the fight against Hitler. But the Nazis weren't about to let that happen. German troops poured into Rome on September 10, 1943, and within hours, the city transformed into a prison. The new occupiers were ruthless and efficient. They rounded up Italian soldiers who refused to fight for the Reich. They hunted down thousands of Jews who had lived in Rome for generations. They searched every building, every apartment, every church, looking for anyone who might be hiding enemies of the Third Reich. And they made one thing absolutely clear. Anyone caught helping Allied prisoners of war, downed pilots, or Jewish families would be shot on sight. No trial, no mercy, just a bullet and an unmarked grave. But here's where the story gets interesting, because right in the middle of this nightmare sat the Vatican, a sovereign city-state that Hitler couldn't legally invade without triggering a global Catholic uprising. Pope Pius XII had declared the Vatican neutral, which meant that technically anyone who made it inside those walls was untouchable. The Nazis could stand at the border, they could watch, they could threaten, but they couldn't cross that line. It was the ultimate loophole in the middle of occupied Europe, and Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was about to exploit it in ways that would drive the Gestapo absolutely insane. He was 45 years old at the time, a tall, athletic Irishman with a sharp mind and a golf handicap that was the envy of Rome's clergy. Before the war, he had been just another Vatican official working in the Holy Office, attending diplomatic functions, living the quiet life of a church bureaucrat. But when the Nazis marched into Rome, something inside him snapped. He couldn't just stand by and watch innocent people be hunted like animals. O'Flaherty had spent years building relationships across Rome. He knew priests, nuns, shopkeepers, aristocrats, and even a few sympathetic Italian fascists who were horrified by what the Germans were doing. He spoke multiple languages fluently and had a photographic memory for faces and addresses. Most importantly, he had access to the Vatican's resources, its buildings, its network of churches and monasteries spread across the city. And he realized something that would change everything. If he could get fugitives inside the Vatican, even for just one night, he could then move them to safe houses scattered throughout Rome, right under the noses of the Gestapo. It was insane, it was dangerous, and it was exactly what he was going to do. By October of 1943, O'Flaherty had already started his operation. It began small, just a few Allied soldiers who had escaped from prisoner-of-war camps and stumbled into Rome, desperate and starving. He would meet them at prearranged spots, sometimes right on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, sometimes in shadowy alleyways just beyond the Vatican border. He would give them food, forge documents and instructions on where to hide. Then he would move them through an underground network of safe houses, monasteries and sympathetic families, keeping them one step ahead of the Nazi raids. Word spread quickly among escaped prisoners. If you can make it to Rome, find the Irish priest at the Vatican. He'll save you." But as more and more fugitives flooded into the city, the Gestapo began to notice. Reports reached their headquarters about an organized smuggling ring operating right under their noses, and they were determined to crush it. The man tasked with hunting down this mysterious Vatican priest was Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Kappler, the head of the Gestapo in Rome. Kappler was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. He had personally overseen the roundup of Rome's Jewish population, sending over 1,000 men, women, and children to Auschwitz in a single day. He ran a network of spies and informants throughout the city, and he had the full authority of the SS behind him. When Kappler learned about the smuggling operation, he became obsessed. He wanted to know who was running it, how they were doing it, and most importantly, how to stop it. And when he finally discovered that the mastermind was a priest named Hugh O'Flaherty, Kappler made a promise. He would capture this so-called Pimpernel, drag him out of the Vatican, and make an example of him that all of Rome would never forget. The hunt was on. The game between O'Flaherty and Kappler began with a simple, terrifying rule. The Monsignor could not leave Vatican territory without risking immediate arrest. Kappler made this abundantly clear by stationing Gestapo agents at every entrance to St. Peter's Square, watching the border 24 hours a day. They had photographs of O'Flaherty pinned to their clipboards, and their orders were explicit. The moment that Irish priest steps 1 inch outside Vatican soil, grab him. Kappler even went so far as to paint a white line on the cobblestones, marking the exact border between the Vatican and Nazi-occupied Rome, just to make sure there was no confusion. It was psychological warfare, a constant reminder that O'Flaherty was trapped, that his little rescue operation was finished. But Kappler had made one critical mistake. He assumed that trapping O'Flaherty inside the Vatican would stop the network. He didn't realize that the Monsignor had already built something far more sophisticated than a one-man operation. The network didn't need O'Flaherty to physically leave the Vatican every night. It needed him to coordinate, to think, to stay alive. O'Flaherty adapted immediately. If he couldn't go to the fugitives, he would bring the fugitives to him, or at least close enough. He began using the daily crowds of pilgrims and tourists who still visited St. Peter's Square as cover. Escaped prisoners would blend into these groups, shuffling forward with the masses until they reached the steps of the basilica, technically still in neutral territory. O'Flaherty would be there, usually disguised, sometimes as a street sweeper, sometimes as a simple laborer, always watching. He would make eye contact, give a subtle nod, and pass along whispered instructions about where to go next. Sometimes he would hand them a folded piece of paper with an address scrawled inside. Other times, one of his trusted couriers, often a nun or an elderly Italian woman, would approach the fugitive and guide them to safety. The Gestapo agents watched all of this happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. As long as everyone stayed on the Vatican side of that white line, they were untouchable. But getting fugitives into the square was only half the battle. The real challenge was what came next, moving them from the Vatican into the network of safe houses scattered across Rome without getting caught. This required an elaborate system of disguises, forged documents, and split-second timing. O'Flaherty recruited dozens of people to help, from Italian aristocrats who opened their palaces to Allied soldiers, to poor families who hid men in their attics despite having barely enough food for themselves. He enlisted priests and nuns across the city to turn their churches and convents into temporary shelters. He even convinced the Swiss Guard, the Vatican's tiny ceremonial army, to look the other way when fugitives slipped through side gates late at night. Every person in the network knew only their small part of the operation. If one person got caught and interrogated, they couldn't betray the entire system because they simply didn't know how it all worked. It was espionage tradecraft inside a priest's cassock. The operation grew rapidly. By early 1944, O'Flaherty and his network were hiding and feeding over 4,000 fugitives scattered across Rome. That's 4,000 people who needed fake identity papers, 4,000 mouths to feed in a city where food was already scarce, 4,000 individuals who could be discovered at any moment during one of Kappler's relentless raids. The logistics were staggering. O'Flaherty had to organize supply lines to get food and medicine to dozens of safe houses without arousing suspicion. He had to forge identity documents that would pass Gestapo inspection. He had to memorize the locations of every fugitive, every safe house, every sympathetic contact, because writing anything down was too dangerous. If the Nazis ever raided his office in the Vatican, a single address book could unravel the entire network and send hundreds of people to their deaths. And Kappler knew something big was happening. His informants brought him fragments of information, whispers about a priest who could make people disappear, reports of Allied soldiers spotted in neighborhoods far from any prisoner camps, rumors of an underground railroad running right through the heart of his occupied city. It drove him mad. He increased the frequency of raids, bursting into apartments at 3 in the morning, tearing through convents, interrogating anyone who looked suspicious. He arrested suspected collaborators and threw them into Rome's notorious Regina Coeli prison, where interrogations often ended in screams echoing down stone corridors. But no matter how hard Kappler squeezed, he couldn't find the smoking gun that would lead him to O'Flaherty's network. The Monsignor was always one step ahead, moving fugitives hours before the raids, shifting safe houses like pieces on a chessboard. The cat-and-mouse game had begun in earnest, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. What made O'Flaherty so dangerous to the Nazis wasn't just his courage or his network. It was his absolute refusal to be intimidated. While other Vatican officials urged caution and neutrality, the Monsignor seemed to treat the entire operation like a personal challenge against Kappler himself. He would stand at the top of the steps of St. Peter's Basilica every single evening at 6 o'clock, right at the edge of Vatican territory, visible to every Gestapo agent stationed below. He would light a cigarette, adjust his cassock, and stare directly across that white line at the German soldiers watching him. It was a daily ritual, a silent message. I'm right here. I'm not hiding, and there's nothing you can do about it. The Gestapo agents would glare back, their hands resting on their holstered pistols, knowing that just 20 feet away stood the man their commander wanted more than anyone else in Rome. But that invisible border might as well have been an ocean. They couldn't touch him. Kappler became obsessed. He began studying O'Flaherty like a detective studies a criminal, learning his habits, his routines, his known associates. He ordered surveillance on every entrance to the Vatican, hoping to catch the priest making a mistake, stepping outside just once. He planted informants inside the Italian communities that surrounded the Vatican, paying them to report any unusual activity. He even pressured Pope Pius XII through diplomatic channels, suggesting that harboring this Irish troublemaker was endangering the Vatican's neutrality. But the Pope, whether out of genuine support for O'Flaherty's mission or simply refusing to bow to Nazi threats, would not hand him over. The Monsignor remained protected within those ancient walls, and Kappler's frustration grew with every passing week. He started taking the hunt personally. This wasn't just about stopping a smuggling ring anymore. It was about pride, about proving that no one, not even a priest hiding behind Vatican immunity, could make a fool of the Gestapo. Meanwhile, O'Flaherty was expanding his operation in ways that seemed almost reckless. He began coordinating with the Italian resistance, sharing intelligence about German troop movements that his Vatican contacts had access to. He helped smuggle not just Allied soldiers, but also Jews fleeing the Nazi roundups that continued throughout 1944. Roman Jewish families would arrive at safe houses with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and O'Flaherty would arrange for them to be hidden in convents, given false baptismal certificates, and absorbed into Catholic households until the war ended. He was playing a multi-front game, hiding soldiers, protecting Jews, feeding refugees, forging documents, and coordinating it all from a small office inside the Vatican, while Gestapo agents literally watched his window from across the square. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking, but audacity comes with a price, and by the spring of 1944, the network was starting to crack under pressure. Several safe houses were raided after neighbors reported suspicious activity. A few of O'Flaherty's couriers were arrested and interrogated, though they managed to reveal nothing useful before being sent to labor camps. One of his most trusted associates, an Italian aristocrat named Prince Filippo Doria Pamphili, narrowly escaped arrest when the Gestapo raided his palazzo, finding evidence of hidden Allied soldiers in the wine cellars. The prince fled to the Vatican just hours ahead of Kappler's men, joining O'Flaherty behind the protective border. Every close call reminded the Monsignor of the stakes. One mistake, one betrayal, one unlucky raid, and hundreds of people would die. The pressure was suffocating, but he couldn't stop. There were too many people counting on him. The breaking point nearly came in May of 1944, when Kappler finally got the breakthrough he had been waiting for. One of his informants reported seeing a man matching O'Flaherty's description outside the Vatican, disguised as a civilian, moving through the streets of Rome after dark. Kappler mobilized immediately, sending teams of Gestapo agents to sweep the area, setting up checkpoints, and ordering his men to shoot on sight if they encountered the Irish priest. For the first time since the occupation began, O'Flaherty was genuinely in danger of being caught outside his sanctuary. And what Kappler didn't know was that the tip was accurate. The Monsignor had indeed left the Vatican that night, disguised and desperate, on a mission so important that he was willing to risk everything. The hunter and the hunted were about to come face to face. O'Flaherty had left the Vatican that night because one of his most critical safe houses had been compromised, and a dozen Allied soldiers were trapped inside with nowhere to go. The Gestapo had the building surrounded, waiting until dawn to raid it. And the Monsignor knew that if he didn't evacuate those men within the next few hours, they would all be captured, tortured for information about the network, and likely executed. No one else in his organization had the authority or the knowledge to coordinate an emergency evacuation of this scale. It had to be him. So he did something he had sworn never to do. He dressed in civilian clothes, a worn grey suit and a battered hat pulled low over his face, and slipped out through a side gate of the Vatican just after midnight. He moved quickly through the darkened streets of Rome, staying close to the shadows, his heart pounding with every step. He had walked these streets 1,000 times before the war, but now every corner could hide a Gestapo patrol. Every sound could be the click of a rifle being raised. The city at night was a different beast entirely. A strict curfew kept most Romans locked in their homes after dark, and anyone found on the streets without proper authorization was subject to immediate arrest. German patrols moved through the narrow alleyways with flashlights and dogs, checking papers, searching buildings, and shooting anyone who ran. O'Flaherty had forged identity documents in his pocket, claiming he was an Italian municipal worker returning from a late shift, but he knew those papers wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. If a patrol stopped him and looked too closely, if they recognized his face from the photographs Kappler had circulated, it would all be over. He kept moving, block by block, using back streets and shortcuts he had memorized years earlier. Twice he had to duck into doorways as German trucks rumbled past, their headlights sweeping across the cobblestones. His breath came in short, controlled bursts. This was not the calculated risk-taking he was used to. This was pure survival. When he finally reached the compromised safe house, he found exactly what he feared. Gestapo vehicles parked 2 blocks away, agents positioned at both ends of the street, waiting. They hadn't moved in yet because Kappler's strategy had evolved. He had learned that raiding safe houses immediately often yielded only the fugitives inside, not the people running the network. So now he waited, watching, hoping that whoever was coordinating the operation would come to evacuate the trapped men, leading the Gestapo straight to the bigger prize. It was a trap, and O'Flaherty had walked right into it, but he couldn't turn back now. Inside that building were 12 men who had trusted him with their lives, who had followed his instructions to hide there, who were counting on him to get them out. He couldn't abandon them just because the situation had become impossible. O'Flaherty made a decision that would define the entire operation. Instead of trying to sneak the men out quietly, he would create a diversion so chaotic that the Gestapo wouldn't know what hit them. He sent word through a trusted courier to 3 other safe houses in the neighborhood, instructing everyone to start moving at exactly 3 in the morning. Dozens of fugitives, Allied soldiers, Jewish families, resistance fighters, all flooding into the streets simultaneously from different directions. The Gestapo would have to choose, chase the targets they had already surrounded, or spread their forces thin trying to catch everyone. It was insane, reckless, and it violated every principle of operational security he had established. But it was the only way. At 2:45 in the morning, O'Flaherty positioned himself across the street from the trapped safe house, watching the Gestapo agents smoke cigarettes and wait. 15 minutes until chaos. At precisely 3 o'clock, the streets of that Roman neighborhood erupted. Doors opened, figures rushed out, people scattered in every direction. The Gestapo agents shouted, flashlights swung wildly, whistles blew. German soldiers came running from their positions, trying to establish a perimeter, but there were too many targets moving too fast. In the confusion, O'Flaherty slipped across the street and into the compromised building. He found the 12 soldiers huddled in a basement, terrified and ready to fight. He told them in a low, urgent voice that they had exactly 90 seconds to get out before the Germans regrouped. They moved as one, pouring out of the building and splitting up into the maze of alleyways, each man carrying forged papers and an address where they could regroup. O'Flaherty stayed behind for a moment, watching them disappear into the Roman night. Then he heard boots on cobblestones behind him, close and getting closer. He turned and saw 2 Gestapo agents running straight toward him, shouting for him to stop. He ran. O'Flaherty ran through the narrow streets like a man possessed, his lungs burning, his civilian disguise now working against him because it made him look exactly like what the Gestapo expected, a fugitive fleeing in the night. Behind him, the 2 agents were closing the gap, their younger legs and military training giving them the advantage. One of them was shouting in German for him to halt. The other was fumbling with his pistol holster as he ran. The Monsignor knew these streets better than any German soldier ever could, but knowledge meant nothing if he couldn't outlast them. He cut left into an alley so narrow his shoulders nearly brushed both walls, then vaulted over a pile of rubble left from an Allied bombing raid months earlier. His hat flew off, tumbling into the darkness behind him. He didn't stop to retrieve it. The Gestapo agents were seconds behind, their flashlight beams cutting through the shadows, illuminating the path he had just taken. He burst out of the alley and into a small piazza, empty and exposed under the moonlight. This was the worst possible place to be, open ground with no cover and no crowds to disappear into. His mind raced through options. He could try to make it to the church on the far side of the square, but the doors would be locked at this hour. He could double back, but that would mean running straight into his pursuers. Then he saw it, a vegetable cart abandoned against the side of a building, and next to it a cellar door slightly ajar. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, wrenched the door open wider, and threw himself down the stone steps into complete darkness. He pulled the door shut above him, just as the Gestapo agents entered the piazza, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. O'Flaherty crouched in the blackness of the cellar, one hand pressed against the cold stone wall to orient himself, the other covering his mouth to muffle his ragged breathing. Above him he could hear the Germans shouting to each other, trying to figure out where their target had gone. The cellar smelled of mold and old wine. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, O'Flaherty could make out the vague shapes of barrels and crates stacked along the walls. He moved deeper into the space, feeling his way forward, putting as much distance as possible between himself and that door. His foot knocked against something metal, and the sound rang out like a bell in the silence. He froze. Above him, the voices stopped. Then he heard footsteps approaching the cellar door. One of the agents had heard the noise. O'Flaherty pressed himself behind a large barrel, barely breathing, as light spilled down the stairs. A flashlight beam swept across the cellar floor, back and forth, searching. The German called down into the darkness, his voice echoing off the stone walls, demanding that whoever was hiding down there come out immediately. O'Flaherty stayed absolutely still, a statue in the shadows. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, miraculously, a voice called out from somewhere else in the piazza. Another Gestapo patrol had arrived, reporting that they had spotted someone running toward the river. The agent at the cellar door hesitated, his flashlight beam still dancing across the barrels and crates. O'Flaherty could see the man's boots at the top of the stairs, could hear him breathing. Finally, the German made his decision. The fugitive must have kept running, must have made it past the piazza. The flashlight clicked off. The cellar door slammed shut. Footsteps receded into the distance, followed by the sound of vehicles starting up and driving away. O'Flaherty remained frozen behind the barrel for another 10 minutes, listening to the silence, making absolutely certain they were gone. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. He had just survived a direct encounter with the Gestapo by pure luck and a few seconds of decision-making. His hands were shaking. He waited in that cellar until the first light of dawn began to filter through cracks in the door above. The curfew would lift soon, and the streets would fill with Romans heading to work, providing the cover he desperately needed. When he finally emerged, his civilian suit was filthy, covered in dust and cobwebs, his face smudged with dirt. He looked like a vagrant, which was perfect. He shuffled through the awakening city, head down, just another poor soul trying to survive the occupation. It took him nearly 2 hours to make his way back to the Vatican, moving in a wide circle to avoid any areas where the Gestapo might still be searching. When he finally crossed that white line back into Vatican territory, when he felt the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square beneath his feet, the relief was overwhelming. He had made it, but the close call had shaken him deeply. Kappler had nearly won. And O'Flaherty knew that the Gestapo commander would be absolutely furious when he learned how close his men had come to catching the Pimpernel, only to let him slip away. The game was escalating, and the next move would be Kappler's. Kappler's fury was exactly as predicted. When his agents reported that they had chased an unidentified fugitive through the streets near the compromised safe house, only to lose him in the chaos, the Gestapo commander erupted. He knew in his bones that the man they had nearly caught was O'Flaherty himself. The timing was too perfect, the coordination of the simultaneous evacuations too sophisticated to be anyone else. Kappler immediately ordered a massive crackdown across Rome. Every safe house address his informants had ever whispered about was raided within 48 hours. Suspected collaborators were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night and thrown into Regina Coeli prison. He authorized his men to use enhanced interrogation techniques, a bureaucratic phrase that meant torture, to extract information about the network. The pressure on O'Flaherty's operation became suffocating. Several safe houses were burned after raids, their owners arrested. The network was bleeding, and everyone involved knew it was only a matter of time before something broke catastrophically. But what Kappler didn't understand, what he would never understand, was that O'Flaherty had built his network on something stronger than fear or money. He had built it on faith and shared humanity. The people hiding Allied soldiers and Jewish families weren't doing it because they were being paid, though O'Flaherty did his best to provide financial support from Vatican funds and donations. They were doing it because they believed it was right, because they couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be murdered. When the Gestapo arrested one member of the network, the others didn't betray their comrades. They stayed silent through interrogations, endured beatings, and some even died in prison without revealing a single address or name. This kind of loyalty couldn't be broken by terror tactics. It could only be exhausted, slowly, one arrest at a time. And O'Flaherty knew that was exactly what Kappler was trying to do, grind the network down through attrition until there was nothing left. The Monsignor adapted again. He decentralized everything even further, creating smaller cells that operated independently, so that if one group was compromised, the others could continue functioning. He changed the location of safe houses every few weeks, constantly moving fugitives like chess pieces to stay ahead of the raids. He developed elaborate coded communication systems using messages hidden in prayer books and innocent-looking letters. He recruited new couriers from unexpected places. Elderly nuns who looked too frail to be involved in anything dangerous, teenage boys who could slip through German checkpoints without raising suspicion, even a few German deserters who had grown disgusted with Nazi atrocities and wanted to help the resistance. The network evolved into something almost organic, constantly shifting and adapting to survive. And through it all, O'Flaherty maintained his daily ritual, standing at the top of the steps of St. Peter's at 6 o'clock every evening, staring across that white line at the Gestapo agents below, silently communicating that he was still here, still fighting, still winning. By the summer of 1944, the tide of the war was turning. The Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6th, opening a second front that pulled German resources away from Italy. In Rome, everyone could feel that liberation was coming. It was just a question of when. But that made Kappler even more dangerous. He knew his time was running out, and he became desperate to crush O'Flaherty's network before the Allies arrived. He authorized increasingly reckless operations, including a plan to kidnap the Monsignor directly from Vatican territory. Diplomatic consequences be damned. Kappler assembled a team of his most loyal SS officers and began surveilling the Vatican's side entrances, looking for any opportunity when O'Flaherty might be vulnerable. The plan was simple and brutal. Grab him, throw him into a car and drive him to Gestapo headquarters before anyone could react. Once they had him in custody, they would make him talk, extract every name and address from his photographic memory, and then execute him publicly as a warning to anyone else who dared to resist. But Kappler never got his chance. On June 4, 1944, American troops entered Rome from the south. The Germans, facing encirclement, were forced to retreat north toward Florence. Kappler had just 48 hours to evacuate his entire operation, destroy sensitive documents, and get his men out before the city fell. In those final chaotic hours, as German trucks loaded with files and equipment rumbled through the streets, Kappler stood one last time at the edge of St. Peter's Square, staring up at the Vatican. He didn't see O'Flaherty on the steps that evening, but he knew the Irish priest was there somewhere, watching, waiting. The Gestapo commander climbed into his staff car and gave the order to move out. He had failed. The Pimpernel had won. But as his convoy disappeared into the Roman twilight, Kappler made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't over. Someday, somehow, he would have his reckoning with Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. When American soldiers rolled into Rome on that June morning, the city erupted in celebration. Romans poured into the streets, waving flags, throwing flowers at the liberating troops, weeping with relief that the nightmare of Nazi occupation was finally over. O'Flaherty stood in St. Peter's Square watching the chaos unfold, and for the first time in 9 months he allowed himself to breathe. The safe houses could open their doors. The fugitives could come out of hiding. The network that had operated in shadows and constant fear could finally step into the light. Over the next few days, Allied soldiers who had been hidden across Rome for months emerged, blinking in the sunlight, reuniting with their units. Jewish families came out of convents and cellars, where they had been concealed under false identities. The full scale of what O'Flaherty had accomplished began to reveal itself. He and his network had saved approximately 6,500 people from certain death. 6,500 lives preserved through forged documents, whispered instructions, and sheer stubborn courage. The American military command was stunned. They had known vaguely about resistance activities in Rome, but nothing had prepared them for the sophistication and scale of O'Flaherty's operation. Intelligence officers interviewed the rescued soldiers and pilots, piecing together the story of the Irish priest who had turned the Vatican into the headquarters of an underground railroad. Newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was an international celebrity. The press called him the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, comparing him to the fictional hero who had rescued French aristocrats during the Reign of Terror. Journalists wanted interviews. Military brass wanted to give him medals. The Vatican, which had maintained such strict neutrality throughout the war, suddenly found itself in the awkward position of having to acknowledge that one of its officials had been running a major resistance operation right under its nose. Pope Pius XII, in private meetings, expressed gratitude to O'Flaherty, but also gently suggested that perhaps the Monsignor might want to maintain a lower profile going forward. But O'Flaherty wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He was interested in the people who had helped him and were now facing consequences. Several members of his network had been arrested by the Gestapo before the liberation and deported to concentration camps in Germany and Austria. Some had been executed, others were still missing, their fates unknown. The Monsignor spent the summer of 1944 working with Allied authorities to track down these people, submitting lists of names, describing what he knew about where they had been taken. Some were found alive in the camps that were being liberated as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. Others were confirmed dead. Each loss hit O'Flaherty hard, a reminder that his victory had come at a terrible price for those who had trusted him. And then there was the question of justice. As the war ground toward its conclusion in 1945, the Allies began planning for war crimes trials. Names were compiled of Nazi officers who had committed atrocities in occupied territories. Herbert Kappler's name was near the top of the list for Italy. He had been captured by British forces in northern Italy as Germany collapsed, and was being held pending trial for his role in multiple massacres, including the execution of 335 Italian civilians at the Ardeatine Caves in March of 1944. It was one of the worst war crimes committed on Italian soil, a reprisal killing ordered in response to a partisan attack on German soldiers. Kappler had personally overseen the execution, ensuring that the correct number of victims were shot and buried in the caves. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He would almost certainly be convicted and executed. O'Flaherty heard about Kappler's capture and imprisonment with mixed feelings. Part of him felt satisfaction that the man who had hunted him so relentlessly was now facing justice. But another part, the part that had become a priest in the first place, felt something unexpected: pity. Kappler was sitting in a cell, waiting for a trial that would end with his death, abandoned by the regime he had served, facing the consequences of orders he had followed. O'Flaherty began to think about something that seemed insane to everyone around him. He began to think about visiting Kappler in prison. Not to gloat, not to confront him, but simply to talk to him, human to human. His friends in the Vatican told him it was a terrible idea. The Allied authorities were confused by the request, but O'Flaherty insisted. In 1946, nearly 2 years after the liberation of Rome, he walked into the military prison where Herbert Kappler was being held and asked to see the former Gestapo commander. The guards, baffled but unable to refuse a Monsignor's request, led him to Kappler's cell. The two men, hunter and hunted, came face to face for the first time without a white line between them. The meeting in that prison cell was one of the most extraordinary moments of the entire story, and yet almost no one witnessed it. O'Flaherty entered the small bare room where Kappler was being held, and the two men stared at each other in silence for a long moment. Kappler, once the feared commander of the Gestapo in Rome, now looked gaunt and defeated, his uniform replaced by prison clothes, his authority stripped away. He recognized O'Flaherty immediately, of course. He had spent years studying this man's face, obsessing over his movements, plotting his capture. And now here he was standing in Kappler's cell, not as a victim but as a visitor. The former Gestapo officer expected anger, perhaps condemnation, maybe even revenge. What he got instead was something he couldn't comprehend: compassion. O'Flaherty sat down across from him and began to talk, not about the war or the network or the chase through Rome's streets, but about ordinary things, about life, about faith, about what comes after everything falls apart. It was the beginning of a relationship that would baffle historians for decades. O'Flaherty continued visiting Kappler regularly throughout his trial and imprisonment. The War Crimes Tribunal convicted the former Gestapo commander in 1948 and sentenced him to life in prison for the Ardeatine Caves massacre. He was transferred to an Italian military prison in Rome, where he would spend the next 30 years. And through all of that time, O'Flaherty kept visiting month after month, year after year. He brought Kappler books, talked with him about philosophy and religion, and gradually, impossibly, the two men developed something resembling friendship. The Monsignor never forgot what Kappler had done, never excused the atrocities, but he also refused to see him as nothing more than a monster. He saw a human being capable of redemption, a soul that could still be saved. It was an act of forgiveness so radical that even other clergy questioned whether O'Flaherty had gone too far. The visits had a profound effect on Kappler. Over the years, he began to open up about his actions during the war, expressing remorse for things he had done, questioning the ideology that had driven him to commit such horrors. In 1959, after more than a decade of conversations with O'Flaherty, Herbert Kappler did something that shocked everyone who knew his history. He converted to Catholicism. The man who had hunted priests, murdered Jews, and terrorized Rome was baptized in prison, with O'Flaherty serving as his godfather. It was a conversion that many saw as genuine, a true transformation of conscience, though others suspected it was merely a performance designed to gain sympathy or improve his prison conditions. O'Flaherty never publicly addressed those doubts. He simply continued his visits, continued offering spiritual guidance, and continued believing in the possibility of redemption even for those who seemed irredeemable. But while O'Flaherty was busy forgiving his former enemy, the world was beginning to forget the extraordinary things he had done during the war. The immediate post-war period had brought him fame, but as the years passed and new crises emerged, the story of the Pimpernel of the Vatican faded from public consciousness. O'Flaherty returned to his quiet work at the Vatican, resuming his duties in the Holy Office, avoiding publicity, living the humble life he had always preferred. He never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition for his wartime activities, and actively discouraged efforts to lionize him. When people asked him about saving those 6,500 lives, he would deflect, insisting that he had only done what any decent person would do, that the real heroes were the ordinary Romans who had risked everything to hide strangers in their homes. He refused to accept that what he had done was exceptional, which perhaps made it even more so. By the early 1960s, O'Flaherty's health began to fail. Years of stress from the war, combined with the physical toll of his constant activity, had weakened his heart. He suffered a stroke in 1963 that left him partially paralyzed and forced him into retirement. He spent his final years in a nursing home, largely forgotten by the world, visited occasionally by a few old friends and by former members of his wartime network who remembered what he had done for them. Herbert Kappler, still imprisoned, wrote letters to him, expressing gratitude for the spiritual guidance that had transformed his life. The hunter and the hunted, now bound together by an unlikely friendship, continued their correspondence until October 30th, 1963, when Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty died quietly in his sleep. He was 65 years old. His funeral was a modest affair, attended by Vatican officials and a handful of people who knew the truth about what he had accomplished. The world barely noticed. For nearly 2 decades after his death, O'Flaherty remained largely forgotten outside of a small circle of historians and the people whose lives he had directly saved. But in 1983, 20 years after the Monsignor's death, something unexpected happened that would resurrect his story for a new generation. A television movie called The Scarlet and the Black was produced, starring Gregory Peck as O'Flaherty and Christopher Plummer as Kappler. The film dramatized the cat-and-mouse game between the priest and the Gestapo commander, bringing the story to millions of viewers who had never heard of the Pimpernel of the Vatican. Suddenly, O'Flaherty was being rediscovered. Veterans who had been saved by his network came forward with their testimonies. Historians began digging deeper into Vatican archives, uncovering documents that revealed the full scope of the operation. The Irish government, embarrassed that one of their greatest heroes had died in obscurity, began efforts to honor his memory. A postage stamp was issued with his face. Streets were named after him in Ireland and Italy. But even the movie, as powerful as it was, couldn't capture the full truth of what O'Flaherty had accomplished. Hollywood needed a clear villain and a triumphant ending, so the film focused heavily on the dramatic confrontation between O'Flaherty and Kappler, culminating in the Gestapo commander's conversion to Catholicism. What the movie glossed over was the grinding, exhausting daily terror of running an underground network for 9 months straight. It didn't show the nights O'Flaherty stayed awake memorizing addresses because writing them down was too dangerous. It didn't show the mental calculations he had to make every single day, which safe house to evacuate, which fugitive to move, which risk was acceptable and which was suicide. It didn't show the people who were caught and executed because his network couldn't reach them in time. The movie gave audiences a hero, but it couldn't give them the full weight of what that heroism had cost. And there was another part of the story that remained largely untold, the fact that O'Flaherty's network had operated with at least some knowledge and tacit approval from within the Vatican, despite the Holy See's official policy of neutrality. Pope Pius XII has been a controversial figure in Holocaust history, criticized by some for not doing enough to publicly condemn Nazi atrocities or protect Jews. But the story of O'Flaherty suggests a more complicated picture. The Pope never explicitly authorized the rescue network, but he also never shut it down, even when the Nazis pressured him to hand over the Irish priest. Vatican resources, including money from the Holy See's funds, were used to support the operation. The question of how much Pius knew and how much he approved remains debated by historians, but what is clear is that O'Flaherty could not have operated as freely as he did without some level of protection from the highest levels of the Church. It was a quiet resistance, conducted in shadows, deniable if necessary, but real nonetheless. The rediscovery of O'Flaherty's story also brought renewed attention to the people who had worked alongside him, the members of his network who had risked everything and received no recognition. People like the Swiss Count Sarsfield Salazar, who had used his diplomatic status to smuggle information and supplies. People like Henrietta Chevalier, a Maltese widow who had hidden dozens of Allied soldiers in her apartment, despite living under constant Gestapo surveillance. People like Father Aldo Brunacci, an Italian priest who had run a parallel rescue network in Assisi, saving hundreds of Jews by hiding them in monasteries. O'Flaherty had been the coordinator, the mastermind, but the network had been made up of hundreds of ordinary people who chose courage over safety. Their stories began to emerge as well, painting a fuller picture of resistance in occupied Rome. Perhaps the most haunting detail that came to light in the decades after O'Flaherty's death was what happened to Herbert Kappler. The former Gestapo commander remained imprisoned in Italy until 1977, when at the age of 70 and dying of cancer, he engineered a spectacular escape. His wife smuggled him out of the military hospital where he was being treated by hiding him in a large suitcase. They fled to West Germany, where Kappler died the following year, never having faced full accountability for his crimes beyond the years in prison. The escape was a final insult to the families of the Ardeatine Caves victims, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed justice can slip away. O'Flaherty, who had died 14 years before Kappler's escape, never knew that the man he had worked so hard to redeem would end his life as a fugitive. It remains one of the most troubling footnotes to an otherwise inspiring story. So why does this story matter today, more than 80 years after O'Flaherty stood on those steps and stared down the Gestapo? Because it reminds us of something we desperately need to remember in our current moment. That ordinary people, armed with nothing more than moral clarity and courage, can stand against overwhelming evil and win. O'Flaherty wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy trained in espionage. He was a priest who saw injustice and refused to look away, even when looking away would have been safer, easier, and perfectly understandable given the circumstances. He built his network one person at a time, convincing shopkeepers and aristocrats, nuns and street sweepers that they had the power to save lives if they were willing to take the risk. And they did. Thousands of them did. In a city paralyzed by fear, where collaboration seemed rational and resistance seemed suicidal, they chose to hide strangers in their homes, forge documents, lie to the Gestapo, and risk execution for people they had never met. That's the real story. Not one heroic priest, but an entire city of heroes. The story also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about neutrality and complicity. The Vatican's official position during World War II was neutrality, a stance that has been debated and criticized for decades, but O'Flaherty's network reveals that neutrality is not a static position. It's a choice that gets made every single day, in every single action. By allowing O'Flaherty to operate, by providing resources, by refusing to hand him over despite Nazi pressure, the Vatican was taking a side, even if it never admitted it publicly. The question for us today is the same question that faced every Roman in 1943. When confronted with evil, is there really such a thing as neutrality, or is silence just another form of complicity? O'Flaherty believed that when human lives are at stake, there is no neutral ground. You either help or you don't, and history will judge you accordingly. And then there's the final, most difficult lesson from this story, the one about forgiveness. O'Flaherty's decision to visit Kappler in prison to guide him toward redemption remains controversial even today. Some see it as the ultimate expression of Christian mercy, proof that no one is beyond salvation. Others see it as a betrayal of Kappler's victims, an inappropriate softening of accountability for unforgivable crimes. Both perspectives have merit, and O'Flaherty himself never tried to reconcile them publicly. He simply acted according to his faith, believing that even the architect of the Ardeatine Caves massacre had a soul worth saving. Whether that forgiveness was justified is not for any of us to decide definitively, but the fact that O'Flaherty extended it challenges us to think about the limits of mercy and the possibility of redemption in a world that often prefers vengeance to reconciliation. The tragedy is that this story, this incredible tale of courage and resistance and complicated morality, was almost lost completely. O'Flaherty didn't want fame. He refused to write his memoirs. He discouraged publicity. If it hadn't been for the testimonies of the people he saved, if it hadn't been for historians who dug through archives, if it hadn't been for that television movie in 1983, his name might have disappeared entirely from history. How many other stories like this have we lost? How many other ordinary people did extraordinary things in the darkest moments of the 20th century, only to die in obscurity because they didn't seek recognition? The fact that we almost forgot the Pimpernel of the Vatican should terrify us, because it means there are probably hundreds of other O'Flahertys whose names we'll never know, whose courage we'll never celebrate, whose lessons we'll never learn. That's why channels like this exist. That's why we dig through forgotten archives and resurrect buried histories and tell stories that the textbooks skipped over. Because every time we forget a story like O'Flaherty's, we lose a piece of the blueprint for how to be human in impossible circumstances. We lose the evidence that resistance is possible, that courage is contagious, that small acts of defiance can add up to something world-changing. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty saved 6,500 lives with forged documents, whispered instructions, and an underground network held together by nothing more than shared humanity. He stared down the Gestapo from the steps of St. Peter's every single evening, a silent declaration that evil would not win, not on his watch, not in his city. And when it was all over, when the war was won and the fugitives were free, he went back to his quiet life and never asked for anything in return. That's the story they didn't teach you in school. That's the hero Hollywood almost forgot. That's the Pimpernel of the Vatican, and now you know the truth.